Joe Ramirez knelt beside the twisted metal hull of what used to be a German half-track, his hands covered in grease and Italian mud. And in that moment, he saw something that would save hundreds of American lives. The machine was supposed to be scrap, worthless debris from a battle 3 days prior. But Joe saw past the shattered armor and blown treads to the brilliance of its suspension system. His commanding officer had already written the requisition to strip it for parts, but Joe had other plans that would get him court-martialed if anyone found out. He was about to steal an enemy design, rebuild American supply trucks in secret, and turn the muddy nightmare of the Italian campaign into something his brothers in arms could actually survive. The question wasn't whether he could pull it off. The question was whether he'd be shot as a traitor or celebrated as a hero when the truth finally came out. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning fog still clung to the hillsides near Anzio when Sergeant Joe Ramirez first laid eyes on the wreckage. It was February 1944, and the Allied forces had been bogged down in the mud for weeks. Their advance stalled not just by German resistance, but by the treacherous Italian terrain that swallowed vehicles whole. Joe had been working as a motor pool mechanic for the 3rd Infantry Division, and every day brought the same crushing reality. Trucks stuck axle-deep in mud, supply lines stretched to breaking, and wounded men dying because ambulances couldn't reach them in time. The rain had turned the roads into rivers of muck and the fields into death traps where even tracked vehicles struggled to maintain forward momentum. Joe was 32 years old, older than most of the boys doing the fighting, with calloused hands and a mechanical intuition that had earned him respect throughout the battalion. Back in San Antonio, he'd run a small garage with his father, fixing everything from Model T Fords to John Deere tractors. And when the war came calling, he'd enlisted with the hope that his skills might keep some young soldier's truck running long enough to save a life. He'd grown up poor, the son of Mexican immigrants who'd crossed into Texas looking for work during the Depression, and he'd learned early that nothing was truly broken if you had the ingenuity to see how its pieces might work differently. His father had taught him to look at machines not as finished products, but as collections of potential, parts waiting to be reimagined into something better. The half-track had been abandoned after a skirmish 2 miles east of their position, left behind when its crew either died or retreated in the chaos of battle. Joe had been sent with a recovery team to assess whether anything could be salvaged, and while the other men poked through ammunition boxes and stripped the machine gun mounts, Joe found himself transfixed by the vehicle's undercarriage. The German designers had created something remarkable, a hybrid system that combined wheels in the front with continuous tracks in the rear, allowing the vehicle to navigate terrain that would immobilize a standard truck. The engineering was elegant in its simplicity, using a series of interlocking road wheels and bogies that distributed weight across the track surface while maintaining enough flexibility to absorb the shock of rough ground. He spent nearly an hour examining the suspension, taking mental notes of how the springs were positioned, how the track tension was maintained, how the drive sprocket engaged with the track links. His squad leader, a young lieutenant named Peters from Ohio, eventually wandered over and asked what was taking so long. Joe lied smoothly, saying he was checking for booby traps, and Peters nodded and moved on, more interested in getting back to base before the next artillery barrage. But Joe's mind was already racing ahead, sketching invisible blueprints in his imagination, calculating whether he could replicate this system, using parts available in their own motor pool. That night, unable to sleep in his tent, while rain hammered against the canvas, Joe pulled out a stub of pencil and the back of a requisition form and began to draw. The sketches were crude but precise, showing how he might attach track assemblies to the rear axles of a standard 2.5-ton cargo truck, the workhorses that hauled supplies and ammunition to the front lines. The trucks they had were good on paved roads but nearly useless in mud, their rear wheels spinning uselessly while loads of critical supplies sat stranded. If he could give them tracks, even improvised ones, they might actually be able to deliver food to hungry soldiers, bullets to machine gun nests, and morphine to field hospitals operating in tents just behind the fighting. The problem was that everything about his plan violated military protocol. He had no authority to modify vehicle designs, no approval from engineering officers, and no budget for experimental work. The Army ran on standardization, on the principle that every truck should be identical so that parts and training were interchangeable across units. What Joe was contemplating was essentially theft of enemy technology combined with unauthorized modification of U.S. military property, offenses that could land him in a stockade for the duration of the war or worse. But as he lay there listening to the rain and thinking about the ambulance that had gotten stuck the day before, leaving 3 wounded men to bleed out before a recovery vehicle could reach them, he knew he had to try. The motor pool where Joe worked was a sprawling collection of tents and improvised shelters about a mile behind the front lines, close enough that they could hear artillery fire, but far enough that they weren't under direct attack most days. It housed dozens of vehicles in various states of repair, from Jeeps with blown engines to tanks waiting for replacement treads. The place was organized chaos, with mechanics like Joe constantly cannibalizing parts from one broken machine to resurrect another, everything covered in a layer of mud and oil that never quite washed away. The commanding officer of the motor pool was Captain Harold Vickers, a career Army man from Pennsylvania who cared deeply about proper procedures and paperwork, which meant Joe would have to work around him rather than through him. Joe's plan started small. He began by volunteering for extra shifts, coming in early and staying late, establishing himself as the guy who was always around and always busy. This gave him access to the motor pool during off hours when fewer people were watching. He also started befriending the supply sergeants, the men who controlled the flow of spare parts and could make things appear or disappear from inventory with the stroke of a pen. He traded cigarettes and bottles of wine, liberated from abandoned Italian farmhouses, building relationships that would let him acquire materials without generating too many questions. One sergeant, a Brooklyn native named Kowalski, who'd worked in his family's scrapyard before the war, turned out to be particularly sympathetic to creative interpretations of inventory management. The real breakthrough came 3 weeks after Joe first saw the German half-track. A pair of Sherman tanks had been knocked out during a push towards Cisterna, and the salvage team brought them back on flatbed trailers to be stripped for parts before the hulls were shipped to a rear area depot for reclamation. Joe volunteered to help with the disassembly, working long hours cutting away damaged sections and cataloging components. What the official reports didn't mention was that he set aside several bogie wheel assemblies, track links, springs, and pieces of the suspension system, hiding them under tarps in a far corner of the motor pool behind a stack of empty fuel drums. Kowalski, who handled the parts inventory, simply marked them as destroyed by fire or too damaged for reuse. Paperwork irregularities that would never be questioned, given the chaos of wartime accounting. Joe selected his first test vehicle carefully. He needed something that was already damaged, slated for major repairs that would give him a legitimate reason to have it torn apart for days or weeks at a time. The opportunity came when a cargo truck hit a mine on the Anzio Albano road, destroying its rear differential and mangling the right rear wheel assembly. The truck was towed in on a Friday afternoon, and Captain Vickers gave Joe the job of assessing whether it was worth fixing or should be written off entirely. Joe immediately said the damage was extensive but repairable, and he began work the following morning with the official mission of replacing the rear axle assembly and suspension components. What he actually did was far more radical. Working mostly at night and in the early morning hours before the day shift arrived, Joe removed the truck's entire rear wheel assembly and began fabricating a track suspension system using the parts he'd hidden away. He cut sections of Sherman tank track to fit the width of the truck, welded mounting brackets to the frame rails, and adapted the bogie wheels to accept the truck's weight distribution. The work was incredibly difficult without proper tools or a machine shop, requiring him to improvise solutions that would have made his engineering professors back home either applaud or weep. He used cutting torches meant for salvage work, a portable welding rig that ran off a gasoline generator, and files and grinders to shape metal by hand when precision machinery wasn't available. The technical challenges were immense. Tank tracks were designed for vehicles that weighed 30 tons or more, with suspension systems engineered to absorb the recoil from a 75mm cannon. The cargo truck weighed less than 4 tons empty, had no armor, and needed to be able to carry a 3-ton load without the tracks shaking themselves apart. Joe had to completely redesign the tension system, using lighter springs salvaged from Jeeps and smaller vehicles to keep the tracks from being overtensioned. He also had to figure out how to connect the drive system, ultimately machining an adapter that allowed the truck's rear axle output shaft to engage with the track drive sprocket, a piece he created by hand grinding a spare gear over the course of 3 nights until it fit precisely enough to transmit power without stripping teeth. One of the biggest obstacles was the front suspension. German half-tracks used wheels in front for steering and tracks in back for traction, but they had been designed that way from the ground up, with a steering mechanism suited to the hybrid configuration. Joe's truck still had regular front wheels and a standard steering system, which created handling problems he hadn't fully anticipated. The first time he tried to start the engine with the tracks installed, the entire rear end tried to pivot sideways under the torque, nearly flipping the truck before he killed the ignition. He ended up having to reinforce the front suspension with stiffer springs and add stabilizer bars welded to the frame to prevent the front end from being overwhelmed by the tracking forces coming from the rear. The noise was another issue he hadn't expected. Tank tracks were loud, clattering and clanking even on smooth ground, and Joe's improvised assembly was even worse because the tolerances weren't precise enough to eliminate play between the links. He worried that the sound would draw attention from anyone within 100 yards, so he experimented with rubber padding scavenged from blown-out tires, wrapping sections of track with strips of rubber that dampened some of the metallic clatter. It wasn't perfect, but it reduced the noise enough that someone might mistake it for a regular engine sound if they weren't paying close attention. 3 weeks after he started, working in stolen hours and hiding his work under tarps whenever anyone came around, Joe was ready for a test run. It was just after dawn on a Tuesday morning, with most of the motor pool still asleep, except for a skeleton crew handling overnight repairs. Joe enlisted the help of Private Marcus Webb, a young black soldier from Alabama who'd proven himself reliable and discreet during late-night poker games, where they'd talked about everything from racism in the Army to dreams of opening businesses after the war. Marcus had mechanical skills of his own, and an understanding of what it meant to work outside official channels when the official channels were designed to keep certain people out. Joe trusted him, and when he showed Marcus what he'd built and asked him to help with the test, Marcus looked at the modified truck for a long moment and then simply nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. Joe fired up the engine, and the truck coughed to life with its familiar rumble, but now accompanied by the strange rhythmic clatter of tracks rotating around their bogies. He eased the transmission into first gear and felt the vehicle lurch forward with a motion unlike anything he'd experienced in a wheeled truck. The tracks bit into the muddy ground of the motor pool yard, finding purchase where wheels would have spun uselessly, and the truck rolled forward smoothly despite the morass beneath them. Joe's heart hammered in his chest as he steered in a wide circle, testing the handling and feeling how the hybrid system responded to inputs. The steering was stiffer than normal, requiring more muscle to turn the wheel, but it worked, the front wheels pivoting while the rear tracks provided propulsion. He drove the truck through the muddiest section of the motor pool, an area near the drainage ditch where water pooled after every rain and where vehicles regularly got stuck. The modified truck plowed through it without hesitation, the tracks distributing its weight across a large surface area and preventing it from sinking. Marcus let out a whoop of excitement and pounded the dashboard, his usual quiet demeanor breaking into a wide grin. Joe found himself grinning too, a mixture of relief and triumph flooding through him as he realized his impossible idea actually worked. They drove for 15 minutes, testing turns and reverse and different speeds, and while the truck handled differently than a stock vehicle, it was drivable and vastly more capable in rough terrain. The celebration was short-lived. Just as Joe was parking the truck back in its repair bay, Captain Vickers appeared in the doorway of the maintenance tent, coffee mug in hand and a confused expression on his face. He stared at the truck for a long moment, his eyes tracking from the normal front wheels to the very abnormal tracked rear end. And then he set down his coffee and walked over with the deliberate pace of a man trying to decide whether to be angry or impressed. Joe climbed down from the cab, his mind racing through possible explanations, none of them particularly good. Unauthorized modification of military equipment, misappropriation of parts from salvage vehicles, working on projects outside his assigned duties. The list of infractions was long and serious. Vickers circled the truck slowly, bending down to examine the track assembly and the welds holding the mounting brackets to the frame. He reached out and touched one of the bogie wheels, testing its stability, and then stood up and looked at Joe with an expression that was impossible to read. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity before Vickers finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. He asked Joe what the hell he thought he was doing, and whether Joe understood that modifications to military vehicles required approval from division engineering and couldn't just be undertaken by a sergeant with spare time and delusions of being an inventor. Joe stood at attention, knowing there was no point in denying what was literally sitting in front of them both, and waited for the hammer to fall. But then Vickers asked the question that changed everything. He asked Joe whether it actually worked, whether this Frankenstein hybrid could really perform better than a regular truck in the mud that was killing their supply lines. Joe said, "Yes, sir, it could," and offered to demonstrate. Vickers thought about it for a moment, and then told Joe to take the truck out to the test range behind the motor pool, a stretch of torn-up ground that was used for checking repairs before vehicles went back into service. Marcus stayed behind while Joe drove alone, with Captain Vickers following in a Jeep to observe. The test range was a nightmare of craters, mud holes, and loose soil, deliberately maintained in poor condition to simulate battlefield terrain. Joe put the truck through its paces, driving through obstacles that would have stopped a wheeled vehicle cold. He climbed a slope that was at least a 30-degree angle, the tracks chewing into the hillside and pulling the truck up with steady determination. He crossed a section of swamp where the mud was nearly 2 feet deep, the truck slowing but never stopping, always maintaining forward progress. He did figure eights and sharp turns to show that, despite the stiff steering, the vehicle was still maneuverable. And finally, he loaded the back with sandbags to simulate a full cargo load and repeated several of the obstacles, proving that the system could handle weight. When he parked back at the motor pool, Vickers sat in his Jeep for a long time, staring at the modified truck and working through whatever calculations were running through his military mind. Finally, he got out and walked over, and his expression had shifted from potential anger to something closer to cautious interest. He told Joe that what he'd done was completely against regulations and that by rights he should be writing him up for disciplinary action. But he also said that they were losing men in missions every day because their vehicles couldn't handle the terrain, and that if Joe's invention could actually solve that problem, then maybe, just maybe, the Army would be willing to overlook how it came about. The question was whether it would hold up to actual combat use, and whether it could be replicated on other vehicles. Vickers made a decision that was either brilliant or career-ending, and probably both. He told Joe to keep working on the truck, to refine the design and document how it was built so that others could potentially replicate it. But he also said they needed to test it under real conditions, which meant sending it on an actual supply run to the front lines. If it worked, Vickers would report the modification up the chain of command and recommend it for broader implementation. If it failed, or if it turned out to be a dangerous liability, then Joe would take full responsibility and Vickers would deny having authorized anything. It was a calculated risk that put both of their careers on the line, but Vickers was desperate enough and impressed enough to take the gamble. The first real mission came 3 days later. A forward position near the Mussolini Canal was running low on ammunition and medical supplies, accessible only by a road that had turned into a muddy morass after days of rain. 2 standard trucks had already tried to make the delivery, and both had gotten stuck, forcing their loads to be transferred to other vehicles, and causing a 6-hour delay. The troops at the forward position were down to fewer than 100 rounds per machine gun, and casualties were piling up in the aid station without enough morphine or bandages to treat them properly. Battalion Command was considering pulling the position back simply because they couldn't keep it supplied, which would mean abandoning ground that men had died to take. Joe volunteered the modified truck for the run, with himself as driver. Vickers approved it, though he made Joe sign a statement acknowledging that he was operating an experimental vehicle and accepting personal liability for any failures. Marcus volunteered to ride along as assistant driver and loader, saying that if Joe was going to get himself killed testing his crazy invention, someone should be there to tell the story afterward. They loaded the truck with cases of .30 caliber ammunition, mortar shells, medical supplies, and rations, lashing everything down securely in the cargo bed. The load was heavy, pushing the truck to near its maximum capacity, which would be the ultimate test of whether the track suspension could handle real-world demands. They left the motor pool at dawn, joining a convoy of jeeps and other vehicles heading toward the front. The first few miles were on relatively solid ground, and the modified truck kept pace with the other vehicles without issue, though Joe noticed curious stares from other drivers whenever they passed. The strange hybrid configuration with its clattering tracks drew attention like nothing else on the road, and Joe caught fragments of shouted questions and comments that ranged from confusion to mockery. One sergeant yelled something about a tank having a baby with a truck, which drew laughs from his men, but also made Joe acutely aware of how bizarre his creation must look to conventional eyes. The convoy split up as vehicles headed to different destinations, and soon Joe and Marcus were alone on a narrow track that led through hills dotted with olive groves and scarred by artillery. The road degraded rapidly, transitioning from packed dirt to loose mud that sucked at their tires and tracks. A regular truck would have started struggling immediately, the rear wheels spinning and losing traction, but Joe's track configuration kept them moving forward with steady purpose. The track spread the weight out over a much larger surface area than wheels, preventing the vehicle from sinking as deep into the mud. And when one section of track did start to slip, the interlocked links allowed other sections to compensate and maintain grip. They passed an abandoned supply truck about 2 miles from their destination, one of the vehicles that had gotten stuck trying to make this same run earlier in the week. It sat at a 30-degree angle in a crater filled with mud, its rear end buried almost to the axles, already being stripped by scavengers for anything useful. Joe slowed as they passed, both he and Marcus thinking about how easily that could have been them, if not for the modifications. The sight reinforced why they were taking this risk, why Joe had spent weeks working in secret to build something the Army had never asked for but desperately needed. The forward position was a collection of foxholes, sandbag bunkers, and camouflage tents strung along a defensive line overlooking the canal. Joe could hear small arms fire in the distance and the occasional crump of mortar rounds landing somewhere to their east. He followed the directions he had been given, navigating carefully around craters and debris until he reached the supply point where a corporal and 2 privates were waiting. The corporal's face showed surprise and confusion when he saw the truck, clearly expecting a standard vehicle, but he didn't waste time asking questions. He just started directing his men to unload the supplies, working quickly to get the truck emptied and back out of the area before enemy observers spotted it and called in artillery. While the men worked, a lieutenant came over to look at the truck, drawn by its unusual appearance. His name was Castellano, and he commanded the infantry company holding this section of line. He asked Joe about the modifications, running his hand along the track assembly and asking technical questions about how it worked and whether it was reliable. Joe explained the basics, trying to stay humble, but unable to completely hide his pride in what he'd built. Castellano listened intently, and then said something that stuck with Joe for the rest of his life. He said that the truck had probably saved lives today, that every hour they'd gone without resupply had put his men at greater risk, and that, whatever bureaucratic hell Joe might catch for building this thing, he should know it mattered to the soldiers who depended on supplies getting through. The return trip was faster, with an empty cargo bed making the truck lighter and more nimble. Joe pushed the speed a bit, testing how the hybrid handled at velocity on rough terrain. The answer was reasonably well, though the tracked rear end created a different dynamic than he was used to, with a tendency to want to swing wide on turns, rather than following the front wheels precisely. He had to develop a feel for it, learning to anticipate how the tracks would respond, and adjusting his steering inputs accordingly. It was like learning to drive all over again, his instincts having to adapt to a machine that behaved according to new rules. Back at the motor pool, word of the successful supply run spread quickly. Mechanics gathered around the truck as Joe and Marcus returned, asking questions and examining the modifications with professional interest. Some were skeptical, pointing out potential problems with maintenance or reliability, but others were intrigued by the possibility of having vehicles that could actually go where they were needed. Joe found himself explaining the design over and over, sketching diagrams in the dirt and describing how he'd adapted tank parts to work on a truck frame. The attention made him nervous, knowing that the more people who knew about his unauthorized project, the more likely it was that someone would report it up the chain in a way that got him in trouble. Captain Vickers, however, was already ahead of that problem. He'd written a report for division headquarters, carefully framing Joe's invention as an innovative field modification developed in response to operational needs, rather than as a violation of protocol. The report emphasized the successful supply run and included a recommendation that the design be evaluated for broader implementation. Vickers was essentially betting his credibility that higher command would see the potential rather than just the rule-breaking, and he deliberately left out the details about Joe working on the project without authorization for weeks. The report made it sound like the modification had been developed over a few days in response to a specific mission need, with Vickers providing oversight and approval throughout. The response from Division came back faster than anyone expected, and it was mixed. On one hand, the engineering staff were interested and wanted to see the vehicle for themselves. On the other hand, there were concerns about reliability, standardization, and whether diverting resources to build more hybrid trucks would compromise maintenance of regular vehicles. A major from the engineering corps arrived at the motor pool 2 days later with a team of specialists, and they spent hours crawling over Joe's creation, taking measurements, examining welds, and running their own test drives. Joe stood by, answering questions, trying not to show how anxious he was about their verdict. The major, whose name was Hendricks and who had a degree in mechanical engineering from MIT before the war, eventually pulled Joe and Vickers aside for a private conversation. He said that from a pure engineering standpoint, the modification was impressive given the limited resources available in a field motor pool. The design showed creativity and a solid understanding of mechanical principles, even if it wasn't up to the standards that would be required for factory production. However, there were legitimate concerns about maintenance complexity, the availability of parts, and whether mechanics at other units would be able to keep the hybrid trucks running without specialized training. The Army had learned hard lessons about the problems that came from having too many different vehicle types, each requiring different parts and different expertise. But then Hendricks said something unexpected. He said that regardless of whether the design could be mass-produced or officially adopted, there was value in having a few of these hybrid trucks available for special situations where standard vehicles couldn't operate. He was authorizing Joe to convert 2 more trucks as proof-of-concept vehicles, with proper documentation and official parts requisition this time. If they continued to prove useful in the field, more might be built. And if they didn't, well, it would be a limited experiment that could be quietly discontinued. He also told Joe that he'd heard the story about how the modification had really come about, the midnight welding and the borrowed parts and the less than official development process. And while he couldn't officially condone that kind of initiative, he understood why it had been necessary. Over the next month, Joe converted 2 more cargo trucks to the tracked configuration, this time working openly with official support. The experience of building the first truck made the process faster, and having access to proper tools and parts that didn't have to be scrounged made the engineering cleaner. He refined the design as he went, making the track tensioning system more adjustable, improving the mounting brackets to reduce stress on the frame, and developing a better seal around the drive sprocket to keep mud out of the connection. Marcus worked alongside him through most of it, learning the techniques and becoming proficient enough that he could probably build one himself if needed. The 3 hybrid trucks quickly became known throughout the division as the go-to vehicles for impossible supply runs. They hauled ammunition to forward positions that were otherwise cut off, evacuated wounded from field hospitals that regular ambulances couldn't reach, and delivered food to troops who would have otherwise gone hungry. The trucks weren't perfect. They were louder than regular vehicles, harder to steer, and required more frequent maintenance to keep the track systems aligned properly. But when the alternative was not completing the mission at all, those drawbacks were acceptable trade-offs. Joe found himself becoming something of a minor celebrity, the sergeant who'd built the Frankenstein trucks that refused to get stuck. Not everyone was impressed. Some officers from the old school thought the whole thing was an undisciplined circus that undermined good order and military standards. There were rumors that a colonel from Corps headquarters had thrown Joe's name around as an example of soldiers taking too much initiative and needing to be reminded about following proper channels. But those criticisms were drowned out by the practical results, by the missions completed and the lives saved because supplies got through. In the brutal arithmetic of war, capability mattered more than protocol, at least for the officers who had to actually fight the battles. The real validation came in April, during the breakout from Anzio toward Rome. The Allied forces finally pushed out of the beachhead they'd been trapped in for months, advancing through German defensive lines in a massive coordinated assault. The offensive required unprecedented logistics, with thousands of tons of supplies needing to flow forward every day to keep the attack moving. The roads were chewed up by tank treads and shell fire, and the spring rains hadn't stopped, turning the countryside into a muddy nightmare. Regular supply trucks struggled to keep pace with the advancing infantry, creating bottlenecks that threatened to stall the offensive before it could achieve a breakthrough. Joe's 3 hybrid trucks were assigned to a provisional supply company tasked with supporting the most forward elements of the advance. For 72 straight hours, he and his fellow drivers ran supplies along routes that were barely recognizable as roads, following tank tracks through fields and forests, fording streams that had no bridges, climbing hills that would have been impassable to wheeled vehicles. Joe himself made 11 runs during that period, sleeping for maybe 3 hours total, surviving on coffee and adrenaline and the knowledge that men were depending on him to get through. The trucks took damage from shrapnel and small arms fire, had mechanical breakdowns that required field repairs in the middle of nowhere, and were pushed far beyond what they'd been designed for. But they kept running, kept delivering, kept making it possible for the offensive to maintain momentum. On the 3rd day, Joe's truck threw a track while climbing a muddy embankment under sporadic machine gun fire. The vehicle lurched to a stop, tilted at a dangerous angle with the right track hanging loose from its bogie wheels. Marcus was in the cab with him, and they both knew they were sitting ducks if German gunners decided to target them. But there was a load of mortar ammunition in the back that was needed immediately by a unit pinned down about a mile ahead. So abandoning the truck wasn't an option. Joe climbed out while Marcus provided cover with a rifle, and he scrambled to the damaged track with a hammer and pry bar, working frantically to realign the links and get them back on the wheels. The process normally took 20 minutes with proper tools and a stable surface to work on. Joe did it in 7, fueled by fear and desperation, hammering the track pins back into place while mud and sweat dripped into his eyes. He could hear bullets cracking overhead, but didn't let himself think about them, focusing entirely on the mechanical problem in front of him. When the track was secured enough to move, he scrambled back into the cab covered in mud and blood from where he'd scraped his knuckles raw on the metal, and he nursed the truck forward, babying the repaired track and praying it would hold together long enough to reach the mortar position. It did, barely, and the crew there used the ammunition to break up a German counterattack that might have overrun their position. Later, one of the mortarmen told Joe that he and his crew had been down to their last 3 shells when the truck arrived, and they'd been preparing to fall back. Joe didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to process the weight of knowing that his mechanical invention had quite possibly prevented men from dying. By the time Rome fell in June of 1944, Joe's hybrid trucks had become part of division legend. They'd completed hundreds of supply runs that would have been impossible for standard vehicles, operating in conditions that tankers claimed were too rough even for their Shermans. The trucks had been shot up, blown up, and beaten to scrap and rebuilt multiple times. But they kept running through sheer mechanical stubbornness and the dedication of the crews who maintained them. Joe had trained a dozen other mechanics on how to repair and modify the track systems, creating a small pool of expertise that meant the trucks weren't dependent solely on him to keep functioning. In July, Major Hendricks returned to the motor pool with news. The Army Engineering Corps had been studying Joe's design, along with reports from units that had used the hybrid trucks in combat. They'd concluded that while the modifications were too complex and resource-intensive for mass production during wartime, the concept had merit for specialized applications. More importantly, they wanted to document the design thoroughly for post-war research into military vehicle development. Hendricks told Joe that his improvised invention would be part of that research, that Army engineers would study what he'd built to inform the next generation of tactical vehicles. There was even talk of Joe being brought stateside to consult on vehicle design, though Hendricks cautioned that such things took time to arrange and might never happen given the chaos of a war still being fought on 2 fronts. Joe didn't know how to feel about any of that. He'd never thought of himself as an inventor or designer, just a mechanic trying to solve an immediate problem. The idea that his midnight welding project might influence future Army vehicles seemed absurd, like something that happened to other people, but not to a poor kid from San Antonio who'd learned to fix cars in his father's garage. But Marcus pointed out that most innovations probably came from people just trying to solve problems in front of them, that nobody set out to change the world, they just did what needed doing, and sometimes it turned out to matter more than they'd expected. The war in Italy ground on through the summer and fall of 1944. Joe's unit pushed north through Tuscany and into the Gothic line, fighting through mountains and river valleys in brutal conditions that made the mud at Anzio seem almost pleasant by comparison. The hybrid trucks continued to prove their worth, though 2 of the original 3 were eventually destroyed beyond repair, one by a direct artillery hit and another when it rolled down a mountainside after the road collapsed beneath it. Joe rebuilt them when he could and mourned them when he couldn't, each truck having developed a personality in his mind from the hundreds of hours he'd spent keeping them running. He trained more mechanics on the track system, spreading the knowledge so that it wouldn't be lost if something happened to him, which was always a possibility in a combat zone. Winter brought new challenges as the campaign bogged down in the Apennine Mountains. The hybrid trucks struggled with ice and snow, the tracks providing good traction, but the cold making metal brittle and causing seals to fail. Joe had to develop new maintenance procedures, including wrapping vulnerable components in insulated materials and running engines periodically just to keep oil from freezing. It was never-ending problem-solving, each day bringing fresh mechanical challenges that required creative solutions. But that was what Joe was good at. What he'd been doing since he was a kid, helping his father keep ancient tractors running on farms that couldn't afford new equipment. News from the Pacific Theater brought stories of similar innovation, Marines and Army mechanics improvising solutions to jungle conditions that factory engineers had never anticipated. Joe heard about tanks modified with flamethrowers, landing craft rebuilt for different missions, and a dozen other examples of soldiers taking standard equipment and making it work in situations it was never designed for. He wondered if history would remember any of it, or if these wartime innovations would be footnoted away as temporary expedients that had no lasting impact. Marcus thought they'd be forgotten. That after the war, everyone would want to move on and not dwell on the jury-rigged machinery that had gotten them through the fight. Joe hoped Marcus was wrong, but suspected he might not be. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, with Germany's surrender bringing an eruption of celebration throughout the Allied forces. Joe was in northern Italy when the news came, and like everyone else, he cheered and drank whatever alcohol could be found, and allowed himself to believe he might actually survive to go home. The motor pool threw a party that lasted 2 days, and somewhere in the drunken haze, Joe found himself trying to explain to a war correspondent what the hybrid trucks were and why they mattered. The correspondent took notes, but seemed more interested in stories about combat heroics than in mechanical innovations, which was probably predictable, but still disappointed Joe in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The drawdown after VE Day was chaotic, with units being disbanded or reassigned as the Army tried to figure out what to do with millions of soldiers who were no longer needed in Europe. Joe was offered the chance to go stateside to work with the Engineering Corps on vehicle development, the opportunity that Major Hendricks had mentioned months earlier. It would mean staying in the Army, at least for a while longer, and working in laboratories and testing facilities instead of field motor pools. Joe thought about it seriously, talked it over with Marcus, who was also being discharged, and ultimately decided to decline. He'd done what he'd set out to do, kept trucks running, and saved some lives in the process. And now he wanted to go home to San Antonio and see if his father's garage was still standing. Before he left Italy, Joe wrote out detailed documentation of the hybrid truck design, complete with diagrams, specifications, and lessons learned from months of field use. He gave copies to Captain Vickers and Major Hendricks, hoping that someone somewhere might find them useful. Hendricks promised that the information would be preserved in Army engineering archives, though he couldn't guarantee what would become of it. Joe accepted that uncertainty, understanding that he'd been a small part of a massive war effort, and that his contribution, while meaningful to him and to the men who depended on his trucks, was just one thread in a vast tapestry. He shipped home in August of 1945, crossing the Atlantic on a transport packed with soldiers all eager to return to the lives they had left behind. Joe spent much of the voyage on deck, watching the ocean and thinking about everything that had happened since he'd enlisted 3 years earlier. He thought about the German half-track he'd stumbled across near Anzio, the spark that had started everything, and wondered if the enemy engineer who'd designed that suspension system had any idea that his work would be copied by an American mechanic and used to keep supply lines open during the Italian campaign. Probably not, but that was how war worked, ideas and technology flowing back and forth across battle lines, each side learning from the other in a brutal exchange that drove innovation faster than peacetime ever could. Back in San Antonio, Joe found his father's garage still operating, though the old man had aged considerably during the war years. They embraced in the garage bay, neither of them particularly good with words, but both understanding what the other had endured. Joe went back to work, fixing cars and tractors, slipping into familiar routines that felt both comforting and strange after the intensity of wartime motor pools. He married a woman named Rosa, who worked as a teacher at the local elementary school, and they started a family, 2 daughters who grew up playing in the garage while their father worked on engines. The hybrid trucks faded into memory, becoming stories Joe told occasionally when other veterans gathered to reminisce. Most people who heard about them assumed he was exaggerating, that the trucks couldn't have been as capable as he claimed or as important as he remembered. Joe didn't argue, didn't try to convince anyone, just kept the memories to himself and the sketches he'd saved tucked away in a box in his workshop. Marcus stayed in touch through letters and occasional visits, and they'd laugh about the time they'd thought they were going to get court-martialed for modifying Army property without permission, and how instead they'd ended up with unofficial commendations and mentions in after-action reports. It wasn't until the 1960s that Joe began to understand the full legacy of what he'd built. He was in his 50s by then, still running the garage with his father, now retired, and his daughters helping with the bookkeeping. A young engineer from a company developing all-terrain vehicles tracked him down, having found references to Joe's wartime modifications in old Army engineering reports that were being declassified and studied by civilian researchers. The engineer wanted to know about the hybrid truck design, about how Joe had solved the technical challenges of mating tracks to a wheeled vehicle, and whether he had any documentation or photographs from that time. Joe dug out his old sketches and the notes he'd written before leaving Italy, materials he hadn't looked at in nearly 20 years. Sitting in his garage with the young engineer, he walked through the design step by step, explaining his reasoning and the problems he'd encountered and how he'd improvised solutions with limited resources. The engineer listened intently, taking his own notes and asking technical questions that showed he understood the complexity of what Joe had accomplished. He told Joe that modern all-terrain vehicle development was exploring similar concepts, combining wheels and tracks and hybrid configurations for military and civilian applications, and that Joe's wartime work had been part of the foundation that later engineers had built upon. Joe never got rich from his invention, never received patents or royalties or official recognition beyond what he'd earned during the war, but he did get to see, in the final decades of his life, how the ideas he'd sketched in a tent near Anzio had contributed to a lineage of vehicles designed to go where roads didn't exist. He read about half-tracks and tracked APCs and eventually about experimental vehicles that combined advanced suspension systems with hybrid drivetrains, and he recognized elements of his own thinking in their designs, the same principles of weight distribution and traction that he'd worked out with a cutting torch and scavenged tank parts. When Joe passed away in 1993 at the age of 81, his obituary in the San Antonio paper mentioned his military service but said nothing about the trucks he'd built or the lives they'd saved. His daughters found his old war documentation while sorting through his effects, and they donated it to a military history museum where it joined thousands of other artifacts from the Second World War. A graduate student researching wartime vehicle innovations eventually found the material and wrote a paper about Joe's hybrid trucks as an example of battlefield ingenuity, but it was published in an obscure academic journal that few people read. Marcus outlived Joe by 5 years, and at Joe's funeral, he told stories about the hybrid trucks to anyone who would listen, insisting that people understand what his friend had accomplished. He talked about supply runs through impossible mud, about wounded men who'd lived because ambulances with tracks could reach them, about offensives that had succeeded because ammunition got through when it was needed. Some people listened politely, others dismissed it as old man exaggeration, but Marcus didn't care. He knew the truth, had lived it, and that was enough. The hybrid trucks themselves were all destroyed or scrapped during or shortly after the war, their components recycled into other vehicles or simply abandoned as the Army streamlined its inventory. None survived into museum collections. No examples remained for future generations to study firsthand. They existed now only in documents and photographs and fading memories. Ghosts of wartime innovation that had solved immediate problems and then been forgotten as the world moved on to new challenges. But the ideas lived on, encoded in engineering reports and passed down through successive generations of military vehicle designers. The principle that Joe had stolen from a German half-track and adapted to American cargo trucks, the insight that hybrid wheel and track configurations could combine the strengths of both systems, became part of the knowledge base that informed post-war development. Joe never knew all the vehicles and technologies that traced their lineage back to his midnight welding sessions in an Italian motor pool, never saw the full branching tree of innovation that grew from seeds he'd planted while trying to solve a single tactical problem. That was perhaps fitting, since Joe had never sought fame or recognition, had only wanted to keep supplies moving and soldiers alive. He'd taken an idea from an enemy vehicle, combined it with American ingenuity and desperation, and created something new that served its purpose and then passed into history. In the end, maybe that was enough, to have seen a problem and solved it, to have saved some lives and contributed something useful, and to have done it all without waiting for permission or approval from people who would have said it was impossible. The hybrid trucks were gone, but the spirit that had created them, the refusal to accept that difficult meant impossible. That was something that couldn't be destroyed or forgotten as long as there were mechanics and engineers and ordinary people willing to look at problems and imagine solutions that didn't yet exist.